Good morning. It's 9 o'clock, 9:30 a.m. On June 5th, and I'm glad to welcome you all to this virtual public workshop on the South Dade Curtain Wall, planning for the South Dade Curtain Wall. My name is Akin Owoshino, and I would be moderating the event today, the workshop today. I'll start by talking through some of the logistics for this virtual workshop and how we hope to run this meeting today. So a couple of things to note. We would like this to be a very engaged session with the public where we can take input as well as share information with all of you in attendance. And to that end, we would like opportunity to take questions and answer as many of them as we can during the session today. If you have any questions at any time, you can send us your question using the question and answer feature in Zoom. And to find that, you need to look towards the bottom of your screen. You would find a box that says Q&A or tab that says Q&A, and you can type your question in that space. Any question that you type in can be seen by all of the attendees. If you have the same question that somebody has already asked, you can move it up in the list by liking the question or voting for the question. We will respond as best as we can today, and we have time on the agenda for addressing specifically questions and answers, but I'll be tracking the questions as they come in, and we'll try to answer as many of them as possible live. And the ones we can't get to live, we will try to make sure that during the Q&A sessions, I read them out and we'll get a response from members of the team here that will be making the presentation to you. So we'll be covering a number of things today. You'll be hearing from presenters talking about the planning process that the South Florida Water Management District is initiating and some data acquisition and collection process that started earlier in the year as part of our overall plan to implement the planning for the Curtain Wall project. You'll be hearing also from people who have done previous work within the region and have had the opportunity to do assessments of the Curtain Wall as part of a strategy for either restoration or flood control or both in South Dade. You'll also be hearing from people who've had experience actually building curtain walls, because there's actually a project within this region. And I'll hopefully have an opportunity to wrap up at the end of that and talk through some of the follow-on actions that we should be having as part of this project. So some of the folks you'll be hearing from today, I thought I'd share a slide that gives you some of the names. As I mentioned, my name is Akin Owoshino. I'm doing this intro. After me, you'll be hearing from Jennifer Reynolds, who will give a welcome address as we open the session. Then you'll have presentations from technical teams, including Brenda Mills, Mark Wolfnack, and Walter Wilcox. And then for a number of partners and stakeholders who have a different point of view or who have a different focus or foci and interest in this topic, we've had some invited speakers who would share some of their experience. So before we go ahead and get started, I just want to share with everybody that we would use, I got a comment and I'll pass that quickly. For those of you using iPads or mobile devices, the Q&A option will be at the top of your screen. For people on PCs, it will be at the bottom of your screen. So for those of you who are attending, we would, instead of taking attendance, which could take a whole lot of time, we're going to use the attendee feature within Zoom to capture the folks who are attending. So if you do not have your name in this space, or you do not have your name in your registration, perhaps at the end of the meeting, you could send an email so we can get your information. But if your name shows you as the attendee, we will be able to track who's attending from that feature. Okay. So with that, I will turn the meeting over to Jennifer Reynolds, who would give the opening remarks.
Good morning. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning for what I hope you will find to be a very interesting and technically satisfying set of presentations. Make sure that you have your cup of coffee and the ability to see the slides. There's a plethora of really fantastic technical information that's going to be presented today. I think Akeen has already talked through how you can access these presentations, but we'll go through that again throughout the workshop today so that you can reference this material as you want to take a look at it in greater depth following the workshop. So we're here today because many times over the last several decades, the topic of seepage management in South Dade has included suggestions that have included things like a curtain wall or a seepage barrier or that idea known by several different names. And what's become clear is that while many successful strategies have been implemented to address storage, there certainly is room for a planning effort to implement a curtain wall as part of this integrated and comprehensive flood control strategy in this part of the system. And so what we're going to talk about today is the research and analysis that the district has done in order to take a look at how these things fit together. So how does restoration, flood control, resiliency, how do those things fit together as we move forward in this same space and these projects are coming online and having synergistic from one perspective and maybe conflicting tensions from another perspective as we move forward in time in operating the system in order to really meet all the water related needs of the region. And so I'm excited to have all of the technical folks on the line here to present this information to you, as well as our guests who are bringing their experience with these types of projects to the table and letting everyone have a very robust conversation about how we move forward in order to implement something that allows us to optimize the needs for water in the system on this south end of our very complicated and incredibly exciting water control system. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Akeen. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. With that introduction done, the first opportunity for Q&A is up. If anybody has any questions before we launch into the technical presentations, this is a good time to deal with them. I haven't received any formal questions from the public yet. I do have a request from one of the panelists to find out if some of the information that we're using at this meeting will be available to share after. And yes, the presentations will be available, and we're keeping track of the questions asked and the responses where they're written, and so that we could share those as well. If anybody has any questions, please again use the Q&A function of the Zoom tool, top of your screen if you're on an Apple product or a mobile phone, and bottom of your screen if you're on a PC or using a regular browser. I don't see any questions for right now, so we'll go ahead and move on to the first of the technical presentations. And I would like to introduce Brenda Mills, Principal Project Manager. Brenda is the project manager for this initiative, and she'll be starting with a discussion on the planning process. Brenda?
Thank you, Akeem. The next slide, please. So I'm going to start with the basics. I mean, the real basics. And talk about a little bit of history about the water management system in South Dade in literally one slide. Before the most recent construction, which is shown on the slide, on the picture on the left, the only option to manage water that was coming in, seeping from the west to the east from Everglades National Park, were the canals and structures, that narrow band of levees, canals, and structures that divided the eastern portion from the western portion of the county. Of course, at that time, the park was new, and this was a new idea. As time has advanced, the Corps, DOI, and the Water Management District have finished construction of a series of levees, detention areas, and pumps shown on the map in the blue, pink, and yellow features that create a 15-mile long, 1 mile wide buffer between the park and the L31 and C-111 canals. So now we have two options of how to move water. You can either pump it into the detention areas, or you can send it south. And of course, there's always a small amount of water that makes its way east towards the coastal structures. But these features were conceived of in early 1990s, given the 25-mile boundary between the park and the developed and agricultural areas on the other side of the canal. And the characteristics of the Biscayne aquifer that underlies it, specifically its tremendous transmissivity and changes in the South Dade system, maybe now is the time to revisit how we manage water in South Dade. Next slide. So once again, starting with the basics of the characteristics of the Biscayne aquifer in South Dade, there are several formations within the aquifer, and I'm just going to speak to the uppermost, the Biscayne aquifer. Mark and Walter will go into more detail in a few minutes. And the concept here is that because the Biscayne aquifer is the water table, the aquifer is known as an unconfined aquifer. It's closest to the surface, and it directly interacts with the natural and man-made water bodies, such as the streams, lakes, canals, and detention areas. And the Biscayne aquifer has huge porosity. Like, I think they call it macro porosity, which equates to world-class transmissivity. Water passes through it with almost no resistance. And the picture in the middle at the top of the slide shows all the holes and cavities in the rocky formations found underground. While the map on the right shows the transmissivity itself and the location of the Biscayne aquifer. And I know you cannot see the scale here, but the dark blue shading, which is further south, is on the order of 1 million to 1.5 million cubic feet per day.
Hey, Brenda.
Yes?
This is Devon. Are you able to speak closer into the microphone? It's hard to hear you.
Thank you for letting me know. So because we tend to put information about water in terms of Olympic-sized swimming pools, I tried to find an example to relate the aquifer characteristics to a swimming pool. So I found this reference from an article on the lower left photo, from an article from 1955 by Parker. And it shows them trying to pump out a pit in Miami. If it was under a regular Olympic-sized swimming pool, you could empty that pool in about 15 seconds with the pumping capacity. But as you can see here, the water keeps coming in. It doesn't stop. And to put this in perspective, we have around 3,000 CFS of pumping capacity. Far more than these 9 small pumps here, but we have 15 miles of boundary to manage between the park and the areas to the west. With that said, we also have changed conditions in South Dade. Next slide. With restoration, more water is reaching Everglades National Park and not just Shark River Slough. Taylor Slough flows have also increased. The graph on the right is the flows measured at the Taylor Slough Bridge, which is just inside the entrance to Everglades National Park. And flows since May 2012 to November 2019 are shown in red on the graphic on the right, while the blue is a repeating average flows for the previous 10 years. As you can see, in each year, except during the localized drought experienced in this area in 2015, recent flows, the red flows, are greater than the historical flows. It's one way to show the changes in South Dade from restoration of the Everglades. There's more water in the natural system. Another way to show change conditions, next slide, is looking downstream further to the south. And I promise this is my last graphic. I'm sure Walter will have more though. This is looking at stages at 18C, the structure that's in C-111 Canal just upstream of S-197. And this is a box and whisper diagram showing, once again, comparing historical stages to more recent stages. In this case, the data isn't quite as recent, but the trend continues today. The middle bar in the middle of the box is the mean monthly stages. And so in each month, except for 2 dry season months, February and May, the mean stages are higher in the recent data, in the recent time period. So we have more flow to the west and higher stages to the south. Next slide. And we know we're going to have more water in the future. We are continuing to work to restore the Everglades. More water is going to be sent at Taney-Micho. And the U.S. the Army Corps of Engineers has planned for these additional flows. We'll go back one slide, please. Has planned for these increases, and they've added more infrastructure around the Las Palmas community, shown on the figure on the right. They've built a levee, 2 seepage collection canals, a control structure, and they have a dedicated pump station to help manage flows within the Las Palmas community. But it's still vulnerable because it is west of the L31N Canal. It's closer to the park, and it still sits on top of the Biscayne Aquifer, which keeps sending water east, especially as we keep adding it to the system. Next slide. And not only, but flooding is also an issue further south. Flooding shown in the right-hand clip is from a series of rainfall events in late 2015. It was the most intense rainfall fell during December 3rd through the 5th in 2015. Folks remember that storm? There was storms on either side of that as well. And you know, the reality was that this was in the dry season. This is not July summer rains or tropical storm rains. These were December rains. And perhaps it's a sign of rainfall intensification. But to give you an idea of what happened, the heaviest rains in this case were in South Miami-Dade in the C-111 and C-103 basins. And these basins received approximately 134,000 acre-feet of rain, which equates to about 1/3 of a foot of water on Lake Okeechobee. So now's the time, next slide, to, you know, as we've been saying, start looking at curtain walls. It can be part of a comprehensive flood control strategy. And, you know, simply put, it allow you to have a little bit higher water levels in the natural areas while achieving a little bit lower water levels in the developed areas to the east. And by placing less permeable material in the flow path helps to manage groundwater, represented by that red bar in the lower graphic. But with that said, we can put the barrier in place. The water will still flow underground, under and around. I know I heard Bob Johnson indicate at I think it was at the governing board meeting last November, that the seepage barrier further to the north by the Limestone Products Association reduces about 25% of the flow. We'll hear more from Bill Baker directly about this issue, but I thought that was an interesting piece of information that he threw out there. So it's the other advantage of a curtain wall would be it's a passive groundwater management solution, not operated, and it also will help reduce the amount of operations we have to do with our pump stations. It will reduce the amount of volume needing to be pumped. Next slide. So with that said, we have information out there already. We have promising results from the South Dade study. And we have, and Walter will talk more about our analysis the Water Management District has conducted. And we also have experience. Like I mentioned, Bill Baker is going to speak to us about their experiences up at the north end, as well as a new project further south. Next slide. So, Aquifer has presented in several forums, including the RAC, the Governing Board, the South Florida and Ecosystem Restoration Task Force, and has described the roles and benefits of a curtain wall in South Dade. And the feedback so far has been positive. We know we had, we've even received, I think, was it in 2018, Rubio wrote a letter, Senator Rubio drafted a letter to this effect, supporting curtain walls in South Dade. So the request is to look at, consider a flood control focused study. And now it looks like a good time to take the next step forward and initiate a public planning process. So with that said, next slide. That's what we're here today to do. Next slide. So the goal is to integrate different sources of information from the public engagement activities, the data collected and prior assessments, identify key concepts to support the design, and help develop a conceptual project that can move forward to perhaps towards design and refinement. So the planning activities include today's public workshop and a future workshop, and we'll talk about this more in a second, as well as some data acquisition and site-specific details, which will be presented by Mark Rosner in just a moment. Next slide. The public engagement activities will allow us to bring in multiple perspectives from all of you, because we are all in this together and need to get more information from you and your thoughts about the risks, potentially to Biscayne Bay and water supply. What do those look like? How should we be evaluating those risks? Helping us determine the best ways to examine saltwater intrusion and sea level rise, and get feedback on potential lengths and depths and locations, and get into some of these details. We've been talking about this at a rather high level for a bit, and maybe now is the good time to start thinking about these types of details, which will include, identifying dependencies for implementation and how we could operate it with the existing infrastructure. And then, of course, explore options for funding and partnerships. Next slide. So the public engagement process will include 2 workshops, as I mentioned, today's workshop, and then a summary workshop where we bring back everything we've heard and learned at the end of the process. And in the middle, we will have a series of one-on-one meetings. So this is where we want to reach out to you and get more information of how we would like to do that. So if you would like to discuss a potential curtain wall on South Dade, including requesting of one of these one-on-one meetings, please contact Brenda, me, or Walter, and we will set something up. Last slide. So the schedule, the overall schedule for this aspect, the planning process, is going to be some more data collection through the end of the year. We're going to do some assessments of the canal system through September of this year. The public engagement process will occur between now and November, and we'll have a wrap-up complete planning process in early next year. So, with that said, I would like to introduce Mark Rosnack, who will be speaking to us about the data acquisition that he's been managing for the water management district.
Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me okay. What I'd like to do is go into a little more detail on some of the concepts that Brenda just presented to give a clear picture of what types of data we're going to acquire during the data acquisition phase, why they are needed, and what we plan to use them for. Next slide, please. Along the L31N corridor where the seepage occurs, you've got the Biscayne aquifer that Brenda talked about, which is a very complex aquifer. It's highly transmissive, and it's comprised of a number of zones of very pervious limestone with some small intermittent zones of dense limestone, and these all control the rate and direction of seepage from the park to the east. And what I've schematically depicted here is that surface water leaks from the Everglades National Park through some shallow restrictive layers, through the aquifer, and sometimes through some interconfining units. And some of the water gets intercepted by the L31N Borrow Canal, which is in the middle of the screen, and some of the seepage can go under the canal and continue east to the urban and agricultural areas, which is in the past has presented some problems. And also, depending on the stages that you have between the park, the canal, and the water table in the ag areas, some water could potentially flow through the canal from the park to the urban areas. The points that I think we're trying to drive home with this data collection effort is that the rates of seepage certainly depend on the properties of the aquifer, that is how the stratigraphy is layered, and how transmissive each of these zones are, and how thick the zones are, and what their order is. And also the size and the depth of the Borrow Canal, along with how it fits into the stratigraphic scheme of the groundwater flow system, that's also an important factor that dictates how much seepage not only comes from the park, but how much is intercepted by the canal and how much continues east. Those are all factors we want to understand better before designing a curtain wall. Next slide, please. Now, the important things we want to take away from this is that seepage rates depend on, first, of course, the water levels. That is the difference in surface water level between the park, the Borrow Canal, and the controlled groundwater levels in the developed areas to the east. Again, the L31 Borrow Canal's geometry and how it fits into its size, depth, and how that fits into the groundwater flow system. And third, the stratigraphic properties of the aquifer, that is how many transmissive zones there are, how many restrictive zones there are, and how these control groundwater flow are all something that we need to understand better. And again, not only the aquifer stratigraphy, but the properties of each zone, that is how transmissive they are for groundwater, how groundwater moves through those zones. We're going to try to get a better understanding of those before we try to control it. Next slide, please. To design a curtain wall, and again, as we all understand, the primary objective of this curtain wall is to help mitigate groundwater-induced flooding to the east due to higher levels in the park, but also we don't want to choke off base flow needed for irrigation and urban water supplies. There's a delicate balance between two competing objectives, and the curtain wall design has to recognize both those competing objectives and be designed accordingly. So to make sure we do accomplish that goal, we need to make sure we develop a very comprehensive knowledge of the superficial aquifer where the seepage occurs along this L31N corridor. And next bullet, please. We want to understand the, again, the geometric characteristics of the Bar Canal, how it fits into the groundwater flow system and how it could affect seepage. Next slide. So the objectives of our data collection efforts to accomplish this would be, of course, to survey the geometric properties of the L31N Bar Canal. Of course, C-111 is just to the south. It'll continue into that. And then we can get an idea as to, again, how it fits in with the spatial properties of the aquifer. We want to characterize this hydrostratigraphic layering within the vicinity of the levee corridor and see what it's like and how it may control groundwater flow. And of course, we want to better understand the properties of each of these zones, how they may steer the groundwater or restrict it or allow it to continue east or whatever. So we're collecting data to accomplish each of these three objectives, which we feel are important for a reliable curtain wall design. Next slide, please. So in order to kickstart the geotechnical data and the geologic data needed to do this, we're going to be acquiring borings, geotechnical borings or lithologic borings, if you will, every half mile, starting at the north near the southern end of the lake belt area, which has already been studied extensively 15 or so years ago by the GS and by the district. We're going to continue that effort south down to S177. And that'll include geotechnical borings every half mile, plus at selected borings, we'll be doing some geophysical logging to help better understand the information contained in those borings. And we expect all this drilling work to be finished by the end of this fiscal year in September 2020. Next, please. This slide, which is prepared by our project manager, BJ Mershra, this helps give a feel for the intensity of our data collection efforts with respect to the scale of the project that Brenda discussed. And as you can see, we're getting a pretty detailed set of borings, which will give us a good picture of the stratigraphy of the aquifer along this corridor. So as the wall progresses south, we want to know how the aquifer characteristics change and how that would affect the wall design as you head north to south. We're going to get a good understanding of the system throughout the length of the proposed wall corridor. Next slide. This gives a little blow up of our data acquisition effort in the vicinity of the Frog Pond area. As you can see, the half mile spacing, even at the scale of one of the individual mitigation projects that Brenda discussed earlier, it's pretty adequate for characterizing the aquifer. You'll get a pretty good grip on the spatial variation of the aquifer hydrostratigraphy as you head from north to south. So this gives a little clearer picture at a local scale of how this effort's going to work. Next slide, please. At each of the borings, the first thing that's going to be required are the lithologic logs, or geotechnical borings, sometimes called, and this will depict at each location how the aquifer materials vary from land surface down to the bottom of the highly transmissive units. And for this one particular example, you can see various alternating zones of either highly porous or weathered limestone with some dense limestone that may restrict groundwater flow. And as you head deeper and deeper into the two bottom boxes there, you can see how it changes to clay and silt, which is characteristic of the underlying Tamiami formation, and that would certainly be an indicator of the maximum depth that you'd want to put the barrier, or you want to stay above that because you don't want to cut off the whole Biscayne aquifer. But that gives us a good feel for how deep all the transmission zones extend from land surface to their bottom. And again, all these borings will be stored in boxes according to industry standards established by the USGS, and they could be examined later in the laboratory to gain further insight into their properties. Next slide. In regards to collecting canal geometric data. This slide provided by one of our senior engineers who's well versed with the surveying methods. We're going to be using we're going to be acquiring, let's say, a continuous bathymetry of the canal. As opposed to traditional cross-section methods where you take geometric cross-sections every certain distance, we're going to be getting a continuous measurement of the geometry of the canal as you head along the whole curtain wall corridor. So we'll have a detailed understanding of the entire geography of the geometry of the canal, and the overbank areas will be included as well, so we understand the entire cross-section of the canal. Within the water, within the wetted area, we're going to be using multi-beam eco-sounder methods, which essentially will give a continuous soundings of the water depth along the canal, and those are converted to bottom elevations. And above the water line where the boat can travel, we will rely on standard LiDAR techniques to acquire very high resolution elevation data. Next slide, please. Again, in acquiring the canal bathymetry, you can see the boat's going to be making a lot of passes back and forth that are overlapping to get a very detailed picture of the stratigraphy. It's not likely to miss a whole lot. And there are standard methods in the surveying and mapping profession where they will come back with the more traditional cross-section methods every, say, 2,000 feet or so, and they will measure cross-sections independently just to ground truth the bathymetry measured by the echo sounding methods. So there will be some checks on the geometry to make sure that it's complete and accurate. And then in the end, there are techniques that we will use to tie the two data sets together. So there is a continuous bathymetry along the entire perimeter of the canal, both above and below the water line. That way our information from land surface to the canal bottom will be complete. Next sound, please. It's standard district practice to acquire LiDAR data through the whole right-of-way, so it can support other projects. But again, this is to emphasize that no information will be missed. So we will know how the aquifer stratigraphy ties into the canal geometry. There will be a connection between the two data sets. The LiDAR data is very high resolution, 30 points per square meter, which will result in a digital terrain model of resolution of 3 inches or better, which is very, very detailed and accurate. Next slide, please. So just to rehash, we're going to be surveying the geometric cross sections through continuous bathymetry of L31N and C-111. And we expect that to be completed by July of this year as a target date. We're acquiring the geotechnical borings and associated geophysical logs to supplement those borings, and we expect that effort to be completed by September and the end of September of this year. And we want to do additional tests to study the hydraulic properties of those various zones. The geophysical logs will help that. There may be some field or other quantitative methods to do that, and we expect that to be completed by the end of the project, which is in November of this year. And I just want to thank my two colleagues for helping prepare these slides that also have in-depth knowledge of this project. Next.
Thank you, Mark. So we've reached another point on the agenda for taking questions and answers. There's a request to move this slide back to the timeline slide. Could you move the slide back, please? Okay. And Director, if you would type your question about the timeline slide. Meanwhile, I'll go through some of the questions that we currently have. All of the questions so far that have been asked have been answered. I think the majority of the initial sets of questions or suggestions were about sound quality, and we'll try to make sure we take care of that going forward. There was a question from Ms. Walsh regarding street flooding in Homestead. She wanted to know if we were looking at this as a result of poor design, street drainage, or as a result of intense storm events, or are we relating the street flooding to increased water levels in the park? And the response we gave was that for the presentation, we were just recognizing that flooding could be problematic through South Dade, and we understand that there could be multiple reasons. And when we do the analysis for this project, we would be looking at which portions of that the cotton wall can address. We also had a request to have one-on-one follow-ups. And as Ms. Mills mentioned in her presentation, the goal is following the workshops to have one-on-one discussions with several stakeholders to make sure that we can capture your issues, concerns, and we can have a more thorough exchange on our plans for moving the project forward. So those are the tech questions that I've received so far. If there are any additional questions that anybody has, please go ahead and type them. We're moving quickly through the agenda, ahead of schedule by quite a little bit. And we really are looking forward to engaging with you. And so would like the opportunity to take your questions, ask them, and deal with follow-ups if you look at the responses we have typed. So just got a question from Dr. Van Lent regarding Mark Wolfnack's presentation. Mark stated that the two competing design objectives were flood control and water supply. That was also the gist in Brenda Mills' slide number 19. Is that correct? I'll go ahead and take this question. We believe that there are multiple objectives that could go beyond flood control and water supply. I think as you would see, as we go through some of the presentations to follow, we're looking at everything, including restoration, environmental needs, potential impacts from rising sea level. So there would be multiple objectives that are being looked at, but right at the vicinity of the wall, I think we're looking at objectives that have to do with flows that cross the wall, either for water supply, for other needs, or to Biscayne Bay or Biscayne National Park, and what's retained on the natural side of the wall. So I think for those presentations, it was expedient to kind of highlight those two pieces, but we hope with this study that we would be looking at all the competing objectives, and through engagement with members of the public, we would be able to find out if there are any objectives that we haven't captured or we're not thinking of right away that needs to be part of the analysis. I would send a response. I'll send a written response to the comment as well. So with that said, if there are any additional questions, I would be glad to respond to them as the meeting goes on, or deal with them when we get to the next Q&A break. Could you advance slide, please? So next on the agenda, we have a presentation from Walter Wilcox, Section Administrator for the Modeling Section at the Water Management District, and he'll be talking about prior assessments in South Dade. Walter.
So good morning. I hope you all can hear me well. I'll keep an eye on the chat just to ensure in case there's any audio issues. I do have some other backup options. And I did see coming in on the chat as Akeen was ending that part of the session, there were questions about how comments should be entered. And I think the Q&A is the primary function for right now, but we do have additional opportunities for input later in the agenda as well. So hopefully we'll come back to those questions. So
Walter,
for this,
just before you get started,
go ahead.
I think Brenda has a hand up to address some of those questions. Brenda, do you want to answer live?
Actually, I hit it by accident, but I did want to mention that we can meet one-on-one, of course, so we can discuss any concerns that you may have, Mr. Van Len.
Okay, Walter, it's all yours.
Okay, yeah, so the purpose of this part of the presentation is really to kind of review some of the many efforts that have occurred in looking at this issue over the past several decades, and really culminating in the most recent work that's been done by the Water Management District to kind of look at the overall system effects that Akeen and Dr. Van Lant were just talking through related to the balance of retaining restoration benefits while providing flood protection with consideration for water supply and flows to Biscayne Bay. And so the point of this presentation really is just to share information that's already kind of out there and attempt to consolidate it so that you don't have to go chasing it in a whole bunch of previous presentations and forums. And it's really designed to kind of begin the conversation. So we really are looking through this public planning process over the next several months to reach out and hear from anyone who's interested in engaging, what your perspectives might be, what you think the potential benefits of this project might be able to achieve, what you think some of the issues or concerns that need to be addressed are. And so hopefully coming out of this portion of the presentation, we'll all have kind of a good starting point for what the wall is capable of doing, and then we can further discuss and refine what we actually want the walls to do. So if you can move on to the next slide. I just want to acknowledge that we're working off of a foundation that's really been provided by many different groups and individuals that have preceded us. The concepts of curtain walls, as Jennifer Reynolds mentioned in the introduction, is not really a new concept. It's been out there since at least the 1990s and probably even before that. And you can see that there are reports that were written and concepts that were detailed that looked at curtain walls as one of the infrastructure improvements that could help to better manage this challenging system that Brenda described earlier, where we're trying to meet multiple objectives for natural and developed systems, and curtain walls seem to be an idea that may play a piece in that moving forward. The concept of curtain walls have been included in comprehensive Everglades restoration plan components, most notably the Central Everglades plan recently. And they were evaluated in the district's 2015-2016 South Dade study. So just to kind of review some of those previous studies, as I mentioned, the SERP, oh, you can go to the next slide, I'm sorry. So in SERP, the curtain wall was part of the original restudy components that were included in alternative D13R. In the modeling, it was treated as a seepage barrier or as a curtain wall, and the description is a little less deterministic. You can see there component V4 of the restudy. But basically some idea that water needed to be captured as it seeped out of the natural system and toward the managed system and returned back to the natural system or retained in the natural system was a component that was around since the very beginning of the restudy. And building on that, the Central Everglades plan, which was authorized in 2015, I believe, included a 4-mile seepage barrier. And if you look at the map on the right, it's kind of that brownish segment along the natural and developed barrier just south of the S356 pump station that's labeled there. So the Central Everglades Planning Project identified that a 4-mile seepage barrier in that location adjacent to Northeast Shark River Slough could help to meet the project objectives of restoring natural flows and stages in Everglades National Park and in the Everglades system, while preventing some of that water from making its way into the developed system and impacting flood control, which is a key consideration for SERP planning. I think, as you know, and as has already been discussed, there's a seepage wall that's already been put in place in the system there through another mechanism. There will be subsequent presentations today that describe that in more detail. So I'm kind of pleased to say that this element of the SERP component has really already been realized in the regional system and is performing very well at this time. So if we can move on to the next slide. The South Dade study looked at, this was a study that was initiated in the 2015-2016 timeframe, kind of reacting to some of the observed higher water conditions in the developed portions of Dade County. And the study really was, again, an open public forum that looked at how do we consider changes in operations or infrastructure to try to make these different systems be managed in a way that best achieves their potential. And I think what we found in the South Dade study was that there were a lot of synergies. And so, some of the comments and questions that we've heard are, is it flood protection versus water supply, or natural system versus built system? Personal opinion, I don't really think that that's the case. I think that what we see is that with features like this, if we're careful about how we design them and we robustly seek different perspectives and try to understand how to bring those perspectives together, there really are a lot of synergies and a lot of benefits that can be obtained really across the spectrum. And so the South Dade study was kind of the first step in exploring and realizing those improvements over the components that had already been identified in previous planning studies, like SERP or like the C-111 federal project that the Army Corps constructed. And so we're really kind of building again on those outcomes as we move forward. So if you can go on to the next slide, I'll come back to those maps, don't worry. So our current thinking and kind of what we're trying to set up here today is looking at these curtain walls as part of a comprehensive flood protection strategy and within the South Dade area. And so the way that we're attempting to frame it is that we're looking to provide flood protection to homeowners in agricultural areas east of Everglades National Park in the developed portions of western Miami-Dade County. But that's not the sole objective. We know that by doing those actions, that from the South Dade study and from the SERP efforts that we've already supported, we know that those outcomes tend to integrate seamlessly with the existing efforts, which are largely focused on restoration within Everglades National Park. And so, as I'll show you in the next couple slides, I think, again, there's a synergy of we can raise water levels in the natural system, attempt to retain the water in the natural system, and by providing the necessary flood protection for the developed system, it allows us to kind of have our cake and eat it too, so to speak, in that we can achieve the natural system benefits to the ENP marsh and to Florida Bay, while simultaneously providing protection for the people and industries that are utilizing the developed lands in Dade County. And so obviously, as we do that, we have to be judicious and careful in how we design these features. And so we always keep an eye on the impacts or potential benefits to water supply and in particular avoiding saltwater intrusion and in providing flows that will continue in the groundwater over toward Biscayne Bay. So if you move on to the next slide. So what I'm going to take you through is a series of modeling products that have been developed kind of in advance of this workshop through the forums that I mentioned, either in the South Dade study or subsequent to it as part of the preparation for this comprehensive flood study. And I want to first explain to you the tools that are used in this assessment and kind of how we go about assessing the feasibility of these curtain wall features in our system. And so we essentially rely on a combination of historical data, observed data, and models to try to get an understanding of how these features may change the performance of the system moving forward. So you've already seen presentations today, and Mark went through a lot of information about the data collection and the types of information that we're gathering to try to understand the real world and try to understand how the system is characterized. We take all of that information and we put it into computer simulation models. And there's really two primary suites of models that I'll describe today that we utilize, and they're used in tandem to try to understand how in the future, if we were to build curtain walls and integrate them with all of the other features that either already exist in the system, like the canals and pump stations and structures, or how they would interact with future actions like restoration flow coming through the central Everglades. We use these modeling tools to try to get an understanding of what to expect in a future system that has not yet been fully constructed. And so the two primary tools that I'm going to describe today are first a regional modeling tool called the Regional Simulation Model. This is a computer model that's developed by the South Florida Water Management District. And for those of you who are actively engaged in the planning arenas, you're probably very familiar with this model. It's the primary tool that's been used to analyze the Central Everglades Plan and other Everglades restoration program elements. It was also recently used to support the combined operating plan development under the Army Corps and DOI's process to define those operations for the upcoming management of the Everglades system. And so this tool is calibrated to historical data. It's independently, scientifically peer reviewed, and we use it to try to understand again how future changes might impact the system. But having said that, it is a regional simulation tool. It's relatively coarse in scale. And so we know when we're talking about features like curtain walls, which are relatively, there's a lot of details that are associated with how curtain walls are implemented. Hopefully you got a feel from that as Mark went through his presentation. A lot of those details are not fully captured by the regional model. And so we basically use companion models, in this case, the USGS ModFlow model, which is a sub-regional groundwater model, to try to dive into detail where we need to and understand things like how deep does the wall need to go? What happens at the edge of the wall when we implement the feature? We know that water is going to flow under the wall, but it's also going to flow around the wall. And so we kind of use these two different modeling tools, the sub-regional model developed by the USGS, which is more focused on the details of the groundwater, and the regional model developed by the Water Management District, which is integrating groundwater and surface water. And between these two tools, we feel like we have a really good kind of technical coverage of that allows us to understand how these proposed curtain walls and how different configurations of the wall might provide changes or benefits in the future system. So if you can go on to the next slide. So kind of starting with the system and showing you how it's integrated into the models. This is essentially a cross section of that upper unconfined aquifer layer that Brenda and Mark talked about of the Biscayne aquifer. And so you can see in the kind of spatial maps on the left, there's a yellow line that runs west to east, across the figure. So if you can imagine that you're standing to the south of that yellow line and looking north, and somehow you were able to see into the aquifer, what you would see is something like what's on the right in this graphic. So you would see that the depth of the aquifer varies from west to east. It kind of starts off a little bit shallower on the western side, and then as it moves east toward the coast, the aquifer tends to get a little bit deeper. You can also see that the aquifer sits on top of the Tamiami Formation, which is that white portion below it, which is relatively impervious. So a lot of water exchange does not move from that upper kind of hashed portion of the aquifer into the areas below it to the white. And within the aquifer, you can see that there's some horizontal lines that kind of move up and down a little bit, kind of starting on the left there at -6 and -27 feet. Those are what we call semi-confining layers. And so water still moves across those layers, and water still moves from one portion of the Biscayne aquifer into the other portions of the Biscayne aquifer. But the hydraulic properties of those layers is such that they're not as transmissive. They don't convey as much flow as the other portions of the aquifer. And so it's useful to know that those features exist, and we're doing additional borings and data collection to better understand where and to what extent they exist, because you can imagine if you're building a seepage wall and you want to try to balance how much water is moving under the wall or around the wall versus how much water is being retained, you need to understand how the aquifer characteristics are going to affect that outcome. And just as kind of a general rule of thumb, we try to kind of link the bottom of our wall in with one of these semi-confining layers if possible, because what that does is that helps to improve the efficiency of the wall at retaining the upstream water in the natural systems where it's desirable, and reduces the amount of flow at the same head conditions under the wall. So just some big picture aquifer information for your contemplation. So if you move to the next slide, when we put these walls in the system, and this is some of the stage data that we've observed after the rock miners wall has been implemented in the system, and again, you'll get a more detailed presentation in the later part of the presentation on this topic. But I just wanted to kind of highlight that what we see from the walls in the real world, again, gathering information to help feed into our analysis. What we see is generally that the water levels, the stage difference between the upstream portion of the wall and the downstream portion of the wall are increased. And so in the graphic on the right, what you can kind of see is that the starting point is the canal levels are the orange and the blue traces. Before the wall, the marsh levels are the green and the black. And after the wall, the marsh levels are kind of the purple and the red. And so you can kind of get a feel that that there's changes that occur in the inclusion of the wall, where you see this delta between the downstream portion of the system or downstream of the wall versus the upstream portion of the wall. And so essentially by putting these walls in place, we can see that in the absence of the wall, the canal and the marsh tend to pull very close to each other. And in the presence of the wall, we see that the water levels upstream in the marsh tend to increase substantially above where the canal levels are. And that's a desirable outcome from the perspective of implementing these walls. So if you move on to the next slide, and just to show similar data in another way, if we look at kind of that delta between a gauge on the upstream or in the natural system portion of the system and a gauge in the managed portion of the system, if we look at those as kind of a well pair, kind of upstream and downstream of the wall, what we see is that in the case before the wall was constructed, there is a gradient from the natural to the developed system already, and that's kind of what's shown in the first column with the stages, in the vicinity of a foot, plus or minus in the data collected from 96 through 2012. But as we implement different portions of curtain walls in the system, and so as the rock miner wall was put in place, first a 2-mile segment south of Tamamu Trail and then a 5-mile segment south of Tamamu Trail, you can see that in general, those deltas start to increase. And so obviously this isn't fully apples to apples. The period of simulation or the period of record is a little different as you move from one data set to the other. But just to kind of illustrate the trend, what you can see is that as you increase the spatial extent of walls, you tend to get an increase in that delta between the natural system and the developed system. And that's a beneficial trend that we're kind of looking for, that would help us to keep more water in the natural system while maintaining lower water levels in the developed system. So let's move on to the next slide. So we take that information and we use it to refine our models. And I'm gonna start with kind of the sub-regional model. So the sub-regional mod flow model was is basically developed by the USGS and Department of the Interior, and it's a well-established tool, and we leverage it for the purposes of, as I said, kind of the detailed exploration of the sub-regional system. If you move to the next slide, that model. There you go. So again, looking at some of those kind of aquifer cross sections, again, similar trends to what we looked at in the conceptual sketch a couple slides ago. This model represents those different aquifer sublayers as 3 model layers, and so it gives us an ability to kind of identify whether walls that maybe cover one of those layers or all 3 of those layers, what types of wall configurations and wall depths are best capable of achieving the desired water level changes that we want to see resulting from the implementation of these walls. If you move on to the next slide. Thank you. And so just to kind of show you the types of outcomes that we can get from these mod flow model applications, you can see here's just a variety of different configurations that have been tested over time. On the left, kind of starting with seepage curtain walls that are implemented, more in the northern portion of the system. And then as you move to the right, the walls become larger in spatial extent, extending further to the south, and also deeper with on the far right, basically a configuration where there's what we call a fully penetrating wall with all 3 layers basically impacted by the wall's construction, and a full spatial extent from north to south. And again, this sub-regional tool just gives you an idea of the types of performance changes that you can expect. And in this case, the light greens and the blues that you see in the Everglades footprint are an indication of higher water levels relative to the starting point before the wall. And the kind of reddish color that you see propagating in the developed areas is an indication of lower water levels relative to the starting point without the wall. So we can use tools like this to understand how to design and at what depths these walls are most effective. So if we move on to the next slide. We also have some other tools in our toolbox, including analytical element methods. And again, we can use these tools to look at things like what you can see in the graphic on the right. You can see that there's an assumed wall, which is constructed basically the kind of reddish line, bluish line that you see in the middle of the diagram between in this case, the frog pond detention area and the developed system. And you can see that the flow lines, which are those red and orange and yellow and blue lines kind of propagating out from where the wall is, that's indicating decreased water profile, basically with the areas closest to the wall having the greatest change and reduction in stage. And as you move further away from the wall, the effects are less dramatic. But what I wanted to kind of show you on this graphic is that you can see as you approach the edge of the wall, you can see that those curves kind of come in and connect to where the wall edge is. And so we know that as we implement these features, we don't just have water moving underneath the walls, but we also have water moving around the edge of the walls. And we have a variety of analytic and physically modeling tools, physically based modeling tools that can help us to assess those impacts in the localities where they may occur. So if you can move on to the next slide. And so with all of that kind of detailed information from the historical data and from the sub-regional and the analytic tools, we use that information to try to refine the regional models and ensure that the regional models are kind of well equipped to approximate the types of changes that we expect when we implement these features. And so this is just an example of one of the exercises that we went through where we were kind of comparing the flow under the wall relative to the stage gradient from west to east of the canal. And you can see that the darker blue line, which is the the mod flow response, and the lighter blue line, which is the RSM response, we can see that there's some correspondence being achieved given the different scales of the model, where basically we're trying to, over time refine the regional models as more data comes in, and as the sub-regional models give us more information, we try to propagate that back into the regional models so that we have a really good feel for what these proposed walls are going to do. So if you can move on to the next slide. And so just really quickly to show you the kind of the current starting point, I would say, for discussion. As part of this comprehensive flood plan strategy, we've already had a lot of discussions. We've already had a lot of feedback over the last several years from a variety of groups. And we've tried to synthesize that into a couple kind of big picture concepts that I want to share with you today, just to get a feel for what may be possible. And again, these are designed to be starting points for further conversation, and we're certainly open to additional ideas or further dialogue on how these concepts may be refined, or if new concepts should be examined. So the three concepts that I'll be covering today include three different spatial considerations of seepage walls. In all cases, these seepage walls are what we call partially penetrating. So they essentially go down somewhere in the neighborhood of, let's say 35 to 50 feet. And the goal is to tie into that second semi-confining layer, the deeper semi-confining layer that I showed you in the earlier slide. And the concept there is basically just kind of for, again, apples to apples. Let's look at kind of a reasonably well performing depth configuration and see if, where we place that spatially, what kind of differences in performance we can expect. And so we're looking at three different configurations. The first is a south wall, where the existing, rock mining wall, which is the purple on these graphics, is already in place. And the south wall configuration, we kind of start at the northern end of the 1.5 square mile area and move out and around the 1.5 square mile area, and then continue down the C-111 perimeter all the way down to S-177. In the north configuration, we kind of go the other direction. So instead of continuing the curtain wall south along the C-111, we kind of started in the 8.5 square mile area and then moved north to connect to the existing wall along the L31 north. And then we also do a little segment in the Water Conservation Area 3B. There's kind of like a little diagonal segment that's kind of hard to see on the map there. But that segment is one of the most transmissive portions in our system. And we know that there's a lot of water that kind of seeps out of Conservation Area 3B and into the L30 and L31N canals that there may be some benefit to controlling seepage in that area. And then on the right is kind of the full extent wall, which kind of combines these two concepts and implements a curtain wall for 31 miles from the southern portion of 3B all the way down to S-177. So if we can move on. So as Akin mentioned, we tried to look at this in a relatively comprehensive way and bring to bear a number of the performance measures that are typically used in other planning studies, including measures of water table and stages. So we want to see what effect the wall is having in terms of, are we reducing water levels in the developed areas? Are we increasing water levels in the natural areas? What are the characteristics of those changes? Are we getting differences in seasonal patterns, or is it different in a wet year versus a dry year? Those types of things. We also typically look at overland flow in the form of model transects. So we're interested in seeing, as we implement these these curtain walls, do we see things like improved flow to Florida Bay or improved flow down Taylor Slough? Those are measures that can be summarized out of the model and looked at. And then, as I mentioned, we also see some of the risk indicators that have come up in previous conversation that we want to ensure we're not realizing those risks. And so with lowered water levels in developed areas, that's a good thing from a flood protection perspective. But if we're not cautious and we take it too far and we continue to see lower water levels during dry times or during times of drought, that could bring with it water supply risks or reduced flows to Biscayne Bay. And so the evaluation tools allow us to look at all of these outcomes, and we hope to work with all of you on the phone to kind of assess and identify what types of performance we think are desirable, moving forward with a project like this. So if you can move on to the next slide. So I'm going to start with some difference maps, and this is just a key to the difference maps. Again, these come out of the RSM model, and we're going to zoom in on kind of that southeastern area where you see all the colors showing up along the areas where we're looking at implementing these curtain walls. But just to kind of give you a code for how to read these maps, if you see colors that are in the cool range, so the lighter blue moving to darker blue, those indicate that relative to a condition that we call the baseline, which is essentially before a wall would be constructed, when we implement the wall and we look at that relative change, what happens when the wall is in place, if it turns blue, it means that it's getting wetter than the condition without the wall. If the colors go into the warm scale, starting with kind of white and then moving through yellow and brown and eventually red, that means that the scenario for that particular curtain wall is getting drier than the starting point without the curtain wall or the baseline. And if you see the whites and the grays, those are relatively similar to the baseline condition, within plus or minus a tenth of a foot typically. And so it's essentially a no change condition relative to the starting point. So if we move into the next slide. So what I'm going to take you through is a series of slides that look at these different wall configurations, and we're starting with the south wall scenario. And what you see here is 3 maps that from left to right move you through the end of the wet season into the dry season. And so that the first map on the left is an average stage for the month of October over the entire simulation period. And so for these models, we run climate record. That's what you see, the 1965 through 2005. We basically throw a lot of different types of years at it. We look at wet years and dry years and average years. And what you're seeing here is the average over that entire simulation of climate record from 1965 through 2005. So it gives you kind of a general indication. And as I said, the models also produce more information about what happens in specific types of years that is useful for understanding how these features are performing. But what you can see here is, again, the 3 maps. The first one starts in October, which is kind of coming out of the wet season and maybe influenced by tropical events like, tropical storms or hurricanes. And then you move a little further into the dry season in December, where typically, water levels have started to recede, and you're looking at a condition where you're transitioning from the dry season into the later part of the wet season into the later part of the dry season. And then April is near the end of the dry season, where conditions are typically experiencing the lowest water levels and the least flows. And so we want to see in those conditions what types of effects we're having. And so what you can see in this graph is that in the left, again, using that color scale of cool versus warm, you can see that with the south wall, we have significant increase in water levels in the natural areas, both in Northeast Shark River Slough and then along the kind of the eastern Marl portion of Everglades National Park, and moving into the headwaters of Taylor Slough, where you see those darkest blue type cells showing up. And so there's an increase in water levels in the natural system, and as you move into the developed system, you can see that instead of those blues, we're experiencing yellows and browns and a couple reds, indicating that there's a drying trend, that with the wall there's a lower set of water levels during these conditions in the month of October. And as you can see, as we move through the seasons, those trends are persistent, but the extent of those trends is different. And so you can see by the time that we get to April, what's happening is there's a lot of water being kind of kept in the natural system, and we see basically increases in water levels in Everglades National Park, and even starting to propagate down toward Taylor Slough and Florida Bay, but we don't see as many changes in the developed system. And so this is kind of indicative of a trend that we we think we're looking for, and we're obviously open to additional perspectives. But if we can try to control water levels at the end of the wet season and early in the dry season, where we provide adequate flood protection for the developed areas during those times, and then as we move through the dry season, we don't perpetuate those lower conditions to the point where we risk saltwater intrusion, or we risk water supply impacts, or we risk reduced flow to Biscayne Bay, then it seems like there's a way that we can use these walls to improve conditions for flood protection within the developed areas. And as a result, we can then retain that restoration water, which is being provided by other projects, retain that water in the natural system and create beneficial conditions in the natural system, extending those water depth improvements into the dry season further, and helping to overcome some of the challenges in getting water to Taylor Slough and to Florida Bay. So if you can move on to the next slide. If we look at the north wall configuration, this is a concept that's basically attempting to manage the seepage out of Northeast Shark River Slough, but doesn't put a wall in the southern part of the system along Taylor Slough or along the eastern boundary. And you can see that in this scenario, the spatial effects are again limited to the areas where the wall is in place. So you can see that the higher water levels in Everglades National Park are really upstream of where the wall is in place, adjacent to the 8.5 square mile area. I don't know if I said it, but in all these graphics, the wall is kind of the pink trace that follows the levee system. If you're not remembering the original graphic that I showed. But you can see with the wall configuration like this, there's some challenges that are identified, and so you can see that even in October, and then as we move through the dry season, some of those drier water levels that we are looking for in the developed system, they're actually propagating over to the western side of the levee and propagating out into Everglades National Park marsh. And so we see that in this particular configuration, although we get some local water level increases where the wall is constructed, in the southern part of the system, there's actually a reduction in water levels on both sides of the levee, in both the natural system and the developed system. And so that may present a challenge moving forward with a configuration like this. And if you go to the last slide, this is with the full wall configuration. And again, combining the north and the south walls, we see similar trends to what we identified with solely the south wall configuration. Water levels lower in the developed systems and higher in the natural systems. I do want to really quickly point out, and it's going to take some PowerPoint logistics, but if you look at the April stages in this scenario on the right, you'll see that the trends are generally what we would typically consider improvements. There's reduced water levels or grays in the developed areas, and those blues showing up in the natural system. But if you move back 2 slides real quickly to the south wall scenario, I just want to kind of visually show for everyone the south wall scenario. While it has similar trends, the trends are actually even more pronounced in the south wall scenario. So you'll notice that in the developed areas, we have a lot more of those grays in the April timeframe, which indicates we're not running a risk of over drying. And in the blues, we see that the water level increases actually propagate further down the system and further down Taylor Slough than in the full wall scenario. And in looking at that, and again attempting to synthesize findings from previous studies, what we're kind of hypothesizing, and we're certainly open to additional discussion and perspective on this. But you see there's a little gap there between the rock miners wall and the top of the 8.5 square mile area in the south wall configuration. And it appears like what's happening is allowing some seepage out of Northeast Shark River Slough to reach the canal system and be pumped south through the existing infrastructure, and then picked up and pumped again by the existing infrastructure into the eastern side of Everglades National Park. It appears like having that little bit of a break in the wall and allowing some of the seepage out of Northeast Shark River Slough to reach further south in the system. It seems like that's providing a little bit more water for Taylor Slough without running flood risk for the South Dade area. And so it's an interesting concept and probably one that we'll need to talk about a little bit more, but just so that everyone's aware, there's kind of a natural dynamic between Shark River Slough and Taylor Slough within the Everglades Marsh, where as water levels increase in Shark River Slough, there's a natural connection that happens where the Shark River Slough, which is kind of, I don't have my mouse, but if whoever's controlling, if you can kind of point to where Northeast Shark River Slough is, just to the northwest of the 1.5 square mile area, yeah, just up a little bit. So as water levels increase in Northeast Shark River Slough, they tend to kind of overtop and start coming down the natural system toward the eastern side and toward Taylor Slough. But during dry times, when water levels are low in Shark River Slough, there's not really an efficient natural connection that can get water down to Taylor Slough and to Florida Bay. And it seems like the infrastructure that's been built that kind of cuts off the natural system and doesn't function in the same way that the pre-drainage Everglades did. It seems like allowing some opportunity for water to make its way out of Shark River Slough and into the canal system, there may be some potential benefit there that's worth further exploring. So I'll just kind of stop there and let's progress with the presentation. So if you can go down one more, there you go. So thinking about this from a flow perspective, I guess just wanted to show some quick trends. So if we look at flows down Shark River Slough, this is an average annual flow graphic that shows kind of the dry season and the wet season flows stacked on each other. And we use this to look at relative comparisons. And so you can see in this particular graphic, the no wall scenario is on the left, and we move kind of from the north wall to the full wall to the south wall scenario as we move across the different conceptual plans. And what this graphic is showing is that, if you go back one more, sorry. If you stay on Shark River Slough, thanks. What this graph is showing is that in all cases where a wall is assumed to be in place in addition to all of the other things that are happening, restoration flows and the infrastructure that's already built, it appears like the wall is promoting more flow through Shark River Slough in Everglades National Park, and that's definitely a beneficial trend. If you move to the next slide. For Taylor Slough, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag. So looking again at the same scenarios, the no wall on the left, the north wall, and then the full wall on the south wall. You can see that both the full wall and the south wall increase flows to Taylor Slough, and those flows propagate south toward Florida Bay. But the north wall configuration, because of some of those drier stages that you saw propagating into the ENP marsh, the north wall actually reduces flow to Taylor Slough in that particular case. And again, kind of interestingly, the south wall only configuration tends to perform a little bit better than the full wall, at least in the modeling representation. And again, our hypothesis for why that's happening is because that small opening to the north of the 1.5 square mile area and south of the existing rock miners wall, it seems to provide some opportunity for water to make its way out of Northeast Shark River Slough and come down into Taylor Slough for some positive benefit in this area. And so if you move to the next slide, but not everything is good news. And this is the flows to Biscayne Bay. And so when we look at the no wall configuration, again, this is kind of a stacked bar for North Bay, Central Bay, and South Bay. The no wall configuration actually has the most flow going to Biscayne Bay. And then as you move from the north wall to the full wall to the south wall, you can see that there are reductions in flow in this round of modeling that decrease flows to Biscayne Bay, and that's a potential thing that we have to be cognizant of. There are some options that we can pursue, and we're obviously looking for others' ideas as well. But there's some probably spatial reallocation. You can see the south wall configuration tends to reduce flow the most in North Bay, and the South Bay flows are actually not as impacted. So there may be some movement of water from areas where, in North and Central Bay where it's not as beneficial to the bay, and trying to get that water into South Bay where it has a greater ecological function. There may be some things that we can pursue there, or there may be things in the actual design of the curtain wall, or as we get more information that can help us to mitigate these impacts that we're seeing here. So if you move on, and so just real quickly, also just to kind of zoom in on the 8.5 square mile area, you probably noticed that all of the walls in these conceptual plans actually go around the outside of the 8.5 square mile area, and basically that's kind of acknowledging some of the findings that have come out of the recent analysis in COP, and some of the recent analysis that has occurred in the observed data in the real world system. So for the 8.5 square mile area, we know that COP was able to find an operating plan that, relative to the baseline of reference, what they call the 83 base in the COP planning process, that the 8.5 square mile area on kind of a bulk scale was able to find that balance of, again, increasing water levels outside of the levee and in Everglades National Park, while maintaining or reducing water levels within the developed system within the 8.5 square mile area. So COP was able to find that balance, and the graphic shows you just an example of kind of a September condition. And if you go to the October, just click once, you'll see the October condition is similar, but you start seeing some of those blues that we'd ideally like to see out in the Everglades National Park marsh. They start encroaching into portions of the 8.5 square mile area. And so if you move on to the next slide, I think what this kind of tells us is that while COP was able to kind of thread the needle, we know that in the presence of restoration flows, we're going to continue to send more water into Everglades National Park and start increasing stages in Northeast Shark River Slough over what we've observed in recent history, or what COP contemplates. And so just the couple last bullets on this slide show you that there are stages that are contemplated, up to 8.3 or 8.5 in some cases in the COP area, or in the COP analysis. But in order to achieve full restoration, we know that we may want to go up to stages as high as 9.7 feet in these areas. And so just kind of looking into the future, even if we're okay in the short term with the COP operations, it's probably prudent for us in a forum like this to think about how we move forward and continue to find that balance between maintaining flood protection in the 8.5 square mile area in the presence of these restoration flows, which are going to continue to increase stages outside of the 8.5 square mile area. Okay, so if you can move on to the next slide. So just in summary, I know that was a lot of information, and hopefully it was clear, but just in an attempt to summarize, I think the key findings that we have so far is that these configurations really show the potential for a well-designed curtain wall to either maintain or improve flood protection in the developed areas of Dade County. And what that will do is that will allow for the restoration flows that are contemplated, that are coming from Conservation Area 3 and sent into Everglades National Park and toward Florida Bay, really to be fully realized, so they can be sent into the natural systems and retained in the natural systems, while still ensuring that the flood protection considerations of the developed areas are maintained. There are some flags that we need to further explore, and we're certainly hoping to get some good feedback from this forum on how to balance those potential impacts to Biscayne Bay and potentially to water supply. So we're certainly open to any feedback, and we can bring our analysis tools to explore any concepts that any of you bring up, or that we want to collectively examine further. We have a broad range of tools, and we're happy to put in the effort to analyze the concepts that come out of this forum. And so we know that when we design these walls in a meaningful way, that we can see some positive benefits, and those benefits are to both the built and the natural system. And as a result, we've received generally positive feedback from the public discussions, including the Water Resource Advisory Commission. And we're hoping that through this forum over the next 6 months, we can continue that dialogue, continue to explore the potential, and continue to address whatever issues may be coming up. So that's all that I had.
Thank you, Walter. So we have a Q&A section that goes here, but before we get into the Q&A, I think Jennifer Reynolds, you wanted to share some thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, because I saw some questions coming in through the Q&A that I just wanted to make sure that we made the answers clear to everybody, because I know probably not everybody is reading through the Q&A at the same time as trying to digest the plethora of information that's being presented. So I just wanted a chance to address something. We're talking a lot in our slides and in the presentation about the flood protection aspect, but I wanted to make it clear as to why we undertook this endeavor. And we didn't undertake the endeavor in order to try and provide better flood protection. Why we undertook the endeavor is as we were seeing restoration projects coming online and looking at how our restoration projects were going to be operated, we had some concerns, and we were hearing some concerns from stakeholders that the restoration projects would not have the potential to not be fully realized. And we wanted to ensure that all of the hard work that we are all doing together to achieve restoration could be fully realized and even optimized, maximized, if we undertook some other potential projects to alleviate concerns. And so that's a lot of words. And what I really mean is that we would see a project like this to enhance restoration goals and flows, not inhibit them in any way. And so I just wanted to make that very clear for everybody on this call, that's the position that we're approaching this from. But that one of the concerns that we've heard from multiple stakeholders as we seek to enhance the restoration goals and affection and flood control concerns, because the SERP projects achieved a very delicate balance between the restoration flows and the flood protection. And so what we undertook were efforts to say, okay, let's make that not such a delicate balance so that we can really optimize the restoration flows. And in order to do that, what additional things do we need to do to mitigate for flood control? And that was the perspective that we're coming from here. So I hope that helps clarify a little bit. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. I am also farming some of the questions out to people to respond to. And I thought I'll just share in addition to what Jennifer said, as I was looking at some of the questions, that all of these are great questions. And part of the reason we're going through this public planning process is that the work we had done previously that we are reporting to you happened in either different forums or happened as a district initiative. And those analyses are old. They're presented for context and to share the information we have. This planning process will include evaluation. There's data gathering that would help refine the models, but we needed to share what we had done and what we had seen so that you were all informed. But the questions you are raising are exactly the type of analysis and assessment that we believe will happen through this planning process over the next several months. With that, I'll summarize the questions that I have so far. Some of them have been answered. I'll go to those ones last. There are a couple of outstanding questions, and I'll read them, and I'll encourage panelists to address these questions. So there was a question that came in earlier from Craig, and it reads, does a slide describing the existing protection for salt intrusion would be preserved assume that existing protections or current conditions are adequate to prevent landward migration of the salt wedge currently in the southern part of the study area and bay? We'll write a formal answer, but I'm assuming, and somebody else on the panel, please correct me if this is wrong, but we're not making such an assumption. And I think we have efforts that are tracking the movement of the saltwater front. I think what the slide was speaking to is that in the evaluation of the impact of the curtain wall, we will have to demonstrate or evaluate its impact on the saltwater front. If it results in a reduction or in making things worse or making things better, that would be part of the consideration in determining if this project is the correct project to move forward with. I think the idea was just to emphasize that that will be part of the assessment. The second question, and there'll be a formal written response to this. I am ad-libbing right now. Another question that came in from Virginia Walsh, and some have been responded to, but this one says, maybe I missed it, but did you show dry season results? I saw the mean dry season results. Also, how is sea level rise being incorporated into the assessment effort? So this might be a Walter response, but I'll give him a minute while I read the next question to see if he wants to take this one. There was a clarification that she meant not average dry season, and I tried to work that into the question itself. There was a question from Stephanie Johnson for Walter, and the question is, are the modeling tools and underlying hydrologic data sufficient to predict with reasonable accuracy the effect of a curtain wall on flows to Biscayne Bay? If there are challenges with predictive tools, what information gaps need to be filled? Again, we'll write a written response, but in a minute, I'll read the last question, and I'll leave some room for panelists to see if they could address this question. And then the last question that I have written so far says, your map of Biscayne Bay effects show only overland flow. What is the effect on groundwater inflows? So for the panelists, any takers to address any of these verbally?
Yeah, I can start with the Biscayne Bay and the dry season questions. Certainly, Akin. This is Walter.
All right.
Yeah, so I guess on the on Virginia's questions, Virginia Walsh's questions related to the dry season, I think what we were showing here today was, as you said, kind of the average monthly progression, and I do want to make clear the models and the data that we can provide for review do include a wide variety of years. So there's dry years, there's wet years, there's average years, and I think what you're teeing up is that probably the most implicit risk with a passive system like a wall is that in the most extreme dry conditions, there could be unintended consequences of having a wall in place. Those are somewhat overcome by the management of the regional system. So we do maintain water levels in canals, as an example, through the operations of the system to try to avoid those saltwater intrusion impacts that Greg described, and all of those assumptions are built into the models. But I think there's a lot more information that we can share coming out of this workshop to allow really everyone who's engaged to dive into the data more and give us your feedback and your suggestions on how we can kind of manage those potential risks. Related to the Biscayne Bay flows, and these come from Stephanie Johnson with the National Academies. I guess I wanted to maybe mention a couple things for context, and I don't know if it's a direct answer to her questions. Well, actually, let me start with the direct answer. So yes, there's groundwater flow changes, and there's also surface water flow changes to Biscayne Bay. And there's a high uncertainty band around the groundwater flow changes. And there's been some discussions in the CISRA panels and with the national academies about, the bringing tools to bear and understanding better, how that groundwater movement to Biscayne Bay and even south into Florida Bay needs to be further examined. But for the purposes of this curtain wall effort, I think we have some advantages when it comes to Biscayne Bay groundwater, I guess the way I'd like to describe those is when the restudy, when those original SERP components were contemplated back in the late 90s, the way that they were modeled was essentially as a fully penetrating groundwater barrier. And so there was some seasonal operations where the groundwater was allowed to flow in the dry season and cut off in the wet season, or vice versa. I don't remember all the details, but the wall was essentially what we would call a fully penetrating wall. So talking about the way in which the wall was constructed in the aquifer, it would essentially fully separate the upstream and the downstream systems from a groundwater flow perspective. In that context, with a fully penetrating wall, there were a lot of issues that were brought up in the original SERP formulation about how cutting off that flow completely resulted in significant groundwater impacts to Dade County and to the local wetlands in Dade County and to Biscayne Bay. And I guess the good news for this project is that although we've looked at full walls, I think that the trajectory that we're on and what we've seen constructed in the system is not to do something that that extensive. Like basically, I had a note on one of my slides that these partially penetrating walls seem to provide the best balance moving forward. And so what we see is if we do what I'm referring to as a partially penetrating wall, something that goes down, in that 30 to 50 foot range, we see significant underflow occurring underneath the wall. And so it's not a question of kind of turning off the tap and letting the downstream system suffer. Instead, we see that the majority of the water still makes it under the wall, but it makes it under the wall in a situation where the water levels are higher in the natural system and slightly lower in the managed system. And so from a perspective of a water budget, most of the types of impacts that would occur for groundwater on Biscayne Bay are being at least partially or even maybe mostly addressed by the fact that we're contemplating partial walls instead of fully penetrating walls. So it's something that we need to look at a little bit more, but within the context of the South Dade curtain wall, I think that we can manage a lot of that from the perspective of how we design these walls, so that as we look at flow that's moving from the natural system into the developed system, we're not going from large volumes of water in today's system to nothing, which is what SERP originally contemplated. We're looking at something that's going from very large volumes to still very large volumes, but under different head conditions. And just to add to that, I think within the SERP arena, there's an upcoming project called the Biscayne Bay and Southern Everglades restoration study that will be tackling a lot of these issues from the perspective of kind of the local groundwater conditions, not so much the curtain wall, but looking at what's necessary from the perspective of surface water and groundwater, and in the context of sea level rise, what's necessary to achieve some of the restoration objectives for Biscayne Bay, for the model lands and downstream in Manatee Bay and Barnes Sound, and also in SERP is taking a lot of actions toward Florida Bay through the EA reservoir and other SEP features. So I think there's a path forward for the overall conversation about groundwater and surface water and how it affects the bay. And from the perspective of the curtain wall, in the way that we're approaching these particular features, we're not likely to create as far afield an impact that would reach all the way to the bay. But we do need to look at it a little bit more, and we need to get all of your input on what those risks might be.
Thank you, Walter. While you were speaking, we got an additional question. What can we do and what additional data are needed as part of this study to reduce the uncertainties in quantification of groundwater flow changes to the bay? So I'll get started on this, and somebody else could join me. So one of the things that I think I mentioned earlier, and I might have typed in one or two of the responses, is what we're sharing to this point represents outcome of work that we conducted a number of years ago. And what we're hoping will happen through this forum and this discussion we're having now is that we will replicate and do some of those works. What we learned at that time was that there were some uncertainty and some gaps that really needed to be filled. So when Mark Wolfnack spoke earlier about some work that was ongoing right now with investigating the geology of the location along the alignment of the wall, that is one of the areas where we identified that we had some gaps in what we knew. So what we're doing right now is we're doing some data gathering, fairly extensive and detailed in the area where we think there was the most unknown. And those would be used to refine and update the tools. They would help with quantifying the flow across the alignment where the cotton wall is now, where the cotton wall isn't now and will be. And so hopefully that would help overall with at least getting the flows right at that location. With regards to continue to the improvement to Biscayne Bay and other locations, I think what I anticipate we will do is we will use whatever available data has been collected since we initially built our models that can be incorporated into the models. We did not currently have plans on doing site investigations all the way towards Biscayne Bay. We were focused more on the location where this project feature would likely go in if it were to be built. So for right now, if anybody has from any of their modeling new information that we may be able to incorporate for the areas away from the location of the curtain wall that can help improve the model, we would take that. And when we come do the rounds, the one-on-one rounds with many of the groups, that's one of the questions that from our end we'll be asking. I'm sure you'll have many, but one of the things that I'd like to see is if there's any new information that could make sure that our tools are better. For right now, we're hoping to rely on a combination of the regional tools that have been used extensively for work within this area, but we also hope to use, like Walter showed, the USGS mud flow model, which is at a higher resolution than some of the tools we had previously, and which hopefully would contain some of the best information that's available out there for right now. But if they need to be improved, we're open to looking at what kind of improvements we could accommodate for the project. Does somebody else want to add to that response? Okay. So one of the things that also came up during the Q&A in the background while the presentations were going was I think there was a desire to be able to speak and share some comments with us. So we're going to move on to the next series of presentations now. But at the end of those presentations, before we start winding down and wrapping up the meeting, we're going to introduce an opportunity for people to put up their hands to ask questions, and we would allow them to, we'll recognize them to speak. At the time, I'll let you know what's involved, but for those of you on phones, I think the process involves dialing *9 to raise your hand, and lower your hand, and *6 to mute and unmute. And folks who are on their devices, I think you would have an opportunity to raise your hand. I'll confirm exactly where you'd find that when that time comes. But for right now, we'll move on to the next series of presentations. And just sharing, there's an existing curtain wall that has been built in, I think 5 miles of it in the location that we're talking about here. And Mr. Bill Baker was a consultant to that project and will be sharing some of the experiences and expectations for the South Dade curtain wall. Thank you, Bill. You take it off.
Good morning. I'm Bill Baker. I'm an engineer with McVicker Consulting. If you want to move to the next slide, the start of my presentation. There we go. Like I said, I'm with McVicker Consulting. Our company has actually been involved with several seepage barriers. Two of note that I'm going to talk about today in the South Dade region. We have the one we built for the Miami-Dade Limestone Products Association at the L31 that's previously been referred to as the Rock Miners Wall, I think. That one was to prevent Everglades seepage. And then I'm going to talk about one that we just completed at a rock mine south of Homestead, SDI Aggregates, that was constructed to prevent saltwater intrusion. Next slide, please. So this is our MDLPA wetland mitigation project. It was constructed to offset impacts in the Lake Belt region for mining. It's at the west side of the L31 Canal, right adjacent to Everglades National Park. And just to the north there, you can see the L29. So it goes from the L29 5 miles to the south. We completed 2 miles in 2012 and then another 3 miles in 2016. This is a 35-foot deep cement and bentonite slurry wall. You can go to the next slide, please. So this is a schematic of the wall overlaid on the USGS geology. What the concept of the wall was to cut off the high flow zones that are represented in blue here that connected the Everglades National Park with the L31 Canal. Next slide, please. So the construction process for this wall, we had a trencher that cut a 35-foot deep, approximately 3-foot wide trench from south to north ahead of the placement of the slurry wall. The trench was backfilled with the cuttings that stabilized the trench and allowed us to construct the wall in daily sections. And then as the wall was constructed, the cuttings were excavated and replaced with the slurry that was pumped over from a batch plant that we had on the east side of the canal. We moved the batch plant along with the construction process, and each day we tied in the new section to 5 foot of the old section. So we can see some pictures of the construction on the next slide. So the top left, I guess, is a fairly famous photo. I've seen it a couple of times today. That's our trencher. The top right is the trencher working in the trench. As it grinds the rock, it shoots the rock adjacent to the trencher. So you have the backhoe that's taking those cuttings, putting them back behind, and they're later placed within the trench. So the bottom left is just an overall picture of that process. And then you have on the bottom right, the trench with the cuttings backfilled in it, ready for the slurry to be placed. Next slide. So like I said, we had a batch plant to mix the bentonite and cement that was on the east side of the canal. That's shown on the top left. On the top right, you can see the process there. We have the backhoe digging out the cuttings, and then you can see the slurry being pumped in on the bottom. Bottom left is just another picture of that process. The cuttings were then taken off-site back to one of our mines in the area. And since this was a previous slide still, please. Okay, since this is a cement bentonite wall, on the bottom right, you see our cores. We took a core of each section and you get a solid wall all the way down to 35 feet. Next slide, please. And this was a very tight area for construction with the canal there on the left and the park on the right. And we managed to construct the whole 5 miles without any issues. And then next slide, please. And when it's done, it's essentially invisible. Next slide. So we have an extensive monitoring program, 3 years of monitoring of the 2 mile wall, and then another 4 years of monitoring of the whole 5 mile barrier. We have a series of paired monitoring wells, one on the park side of the wall and one on the canal side of the wall, and then a series of flow meters within the canal. You can slice and dice this data in a lot of different ways. I think Walter showed a slide with a whole bunch of lines on it. But what I want to focus on, the most compelling data, is in the center of the wall. And then looking at the bottom there, we have a paired set of wells that are control, where there's no wall. And then looking at a well within the park. So next slide, please. So we'll focus on the orange and blue lines here. On the y-axis, we have the difference in feet. So the difference between the well on the park side and the well on the canal side. So you can see on the x-axis is time. So starting in 2012, when there was no wall at the 3 mile and 2.5 mile wells, there's very little difference between the two wells. We didn't collect data during construction, so you have a gap in our data. But then you can see after the wall is installed, a high degree of separation between the upstream and downstream wells. So we're getting upwards of 1.6 feet difference in the wet season. And then you can see our control, just to make sure nothing else was going on. The black line, nothing really, there's no change between the upstream and downstream wells. So we can move to the next slide. This is the same data with G3576 within the park, overlaid. The stage is on the secondary axis there. And you can see that there was a difference in stage and increase in the wet season after we installed the wall there, the 5 miles of wall. Next slide, please. So this is the modeling that we did to sell the additional 3 miles of wall. And we were showing that we would get about a 0.4 increase in stage right adjacent to the wall in the middle. So it looks like we've exceeded our expectations. Okay, moving on to the next slide. This is our other project that we just did. This is a quarry south of Homestead in Florida City. You can see the FP&L cooling ponds to the southwest, and the bay there to the east. Next slide, please. So when we took over this project, we took over the permitting, and we were not expecting to construct a slurry wall. But things changed. You can see on the right there, the yellow line is the USGS approximation of the saltwater front in 2011. And the red line you can see is the approximation in 2016. We have an extensive set of monitoring wells around the mine. But the key one is that MW5, which you can see is sort of to the northeast of our mine, which are shown with the ABCDE lakes. Yeah, that's it right there, MW5. So if you go to the next slide. This is data at MW5. What you see on the y-axis, you have depth in the well. And then on the x-axis, you have specific conductance, which is a surrogate for chlorides. The dotted red line is our permit limit, which equates to about 250 chlorides. The first time we went out there in 2018, we exceeded the limit. And it's only gone up in subsequent visits. So next slide. So as a condition of our permit, we were required to mitigate to make sure that the salt front would not get into our freshwater ponds. So our decision was to construct a slurry wall. And the alignment we chose is shown in pink there. It's a total of 1 mile, quarter mile sections on the top and bottom, and half-mile section to the east. Next slide, please. This wall is quite a bit different from the wall that we built at the L31. We had to go down much deeper, down to about 80 feet, 75 to 85 feet below ground surface. That was to tie into a less permeable silty sand layer. Like Walter had said, the aquifer is quite a bit thicker here. And the construction process for this wall was quite a bit different also. There isn't a chainsaw trencher device that can go down to 80 feet. So we had to blast the rock first. And then we used a long stick excavator to dig the trench, which was replaced with just bentonite slurry that held the trench open while we were excavating. And then later we backfilled it with marl material that mixed with the slurry to create the wall. The next slide, we have some photos of our construction process. You can see here in the foreground is our long stick excavating the trench. You can see the trench filled with slurry there going. At that time, it was east to west. And then in the far background, you can see another backhoe placing in the marl backfill material that gets mixed with the slurry. Next slide, please. So this is if you are looking underground at the side of the wall construction. To better illustrate what's going on, you have the trench bottom shown in kind of the orange is being excavated down between 75 and 80 feet. We had an engineer on site that would check the material as it came up to guarantee that we got into that silty sand layer. And then you have the liquid slurry kind of as a wedge on the top that helps hold the trench open as we excavate it. And then we have the backfill and slurry mixture that follows along behind the trench excavation. And we took many tests, and our average permeability was 8 × 10⁻⁷, which exceeded our specs for the job. So next slide, please. This is another photo of the operation. You remember we had the corners there. It worked just fine going around the corners. The wedge of backfill and slurry followed the trenching right around the corner without any problems. Next slide. And this one didn't require a batch plant because it was just slurry and bentonite. So we just built a little pond, mixed the bentonite with water, and pumped it over to the trench excavation. Like I said, we just completed this maybe 2-3 weeks ago, and we're still monitoring all of our wells, and it remains to be seen what's going to happen. But we're pretty hopeful that it's going to stop the salt from getting into the lakes. And I think that's my last slide. If there's any questions.
Thank you very much, Bill. We will accumulate the questions when we get to the next Q&A session. Thanks, Bill. The next speaker is Charles LaPrade, and Mr. LaPrade will be talking about South Dade cotton wool and agriculture. Charles, if you would want to take it.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Good morning. Hold on just a second. There we go. Okay, you can turn the page. Hit the slide. So, a couple things I'm going to discuss is the fact that a curtain wall in this area was recommended a long time ago to contain what was intended to be a lot of additional water moved into the area for restoration. That time and still today, it's been supported by the agricultural industry in that area. And I'll touch a little bit on our agriculture's groundwater issues and the northern segment is already there. And then go to the next slide if you could. We'll just move past that. So agriculture needs water. Make no mistake about that. We have to irrigate. Crops need the water. Too much water, too high groundwater levels, kills plants, causes bacteria, and it erodes the natural ability of the land to absorb normal rainfall and move it out. And that creates significant damage. Next slide. So this was back in 2014. And these were the canal levels. I believe this was either late October, early November, throughout the study area. And that was exacerbating root zone damage. This was not due to a rain. This was movement of water to the south and impounded in the area and stuff leaching out of the impoundment areas. Next slide. Which was causing a groundwater level like that in the fields. Next slide. These are pictures after 0.8 of an inch of rain in November 2014. Next slide. When water stands in the fields like that, it creates a lot of bacteria. That water would not move out of the system because of the groundwater in that area was held very high. The next slide. You can see the bacteria moving through the field there due to the continuous high water. This was not associated with any large-scale rain event whatsoever. As I said, this was 0.8 of an inch of rain, which our percolation rates in South Dade should not happen with that level of rainfall. Next slide. So another thing that we're seeing, that the county did a septic tank vulnerability study. I urge everybody to look at that. It touches sea level rise, climate change, and all those other things. You have in red there the minimum separation needed for it to work from both the EPA and the Department of Health, 24 to 48 inches. If you saw those previous pictures, that wasn't 24 or 48 inches. Go to your next slide. These are some excerpts from that study, which is available at miamidade.gov. You will see this is a projection in 2030 for vulnerable residential and non-residential septic facilities. Go to the next slide. This is a percentage projection of vulnerability of septic tanks 2020. The study was done in 17. So those that you see in the western area of the county were not for the consultant subject based on sea level rise. That was water coming from the west. So it's not just agriculture. That's also impacting, that groundwater seepage is greatly impacting people that have been out there. Go to the next slide. very similar. This is a 2030 or 2040, excuse me. So you can see how that's projected to increase. Next slide. Another thing I wanted to ask as we look at this is a Category 3 storm surge projection from the National Hurricane Center and their Slough model. I would like to know, as we look at this curtain wall, how it would impact or exacerbate any storm surge that could be there, because we're already losing the ability well inland for insurance. Companies are backing out of writing insurance on barns, shade houses, those type of things based on these models here. The next slide. So our concerns, my concerns are continuing adequate water supply for agriculture. You know, how is the wall going to impact that? Will it adversely impact or help with drainage? Are there gaps needed? What is the impact around those gaps? I would assume you would see a higher groundwater elevation where there are gaps. Where would those be located? Location, length, depth, obviously. You know, the call for thorough modeling on all sides, I believe, is there. And of course, who's going to pay for it and how quickly can that happen? That's always a big question. But certainly helpful. Want to be helpful in this and work through all the questions with everybody, including impacts of Biscayne Bay, saltwater intrusion, all of those issues. But as said, this was a recommendation a long time ago. We have, in the agricultural industry, especially in that area, over the past 10 years, suffered significantly due to elevated water tables. And that's basically my concerns. That's all.
Thank you very much, Carl. If anybody has any questions for either of those two speakers, please type them in. I will take them when we have the last talk. The next speaker is Eric Stapnew, and Eric will be talking about seepage management, the solution space. Eric, you will take it on.
All right, are we hearing me now?
We do, we hear you.
Where we can solve the various problems that we're challenged with in this seepage barrier study. Next slide, please. Okay, so in our world, I'm going to talk briefly about some overarching goals. I'm not going into as much of a technical discussion as was being seen in many of the other presentations we've had along the way. They've done some preliminary studies and worked on an initial section of wall. There's a lot of data involved in working on that. We, on the other hand, have been primarily partners in watching to be sure that we're not ending up with adverse effects to one of our park resources, Biscayne National Park, in terms of groundwater and surface water flow, while we're also getting ourselves into a better position for maintaining more of the water that's going to come down to Everglades National Park through the implementation of more of the restoration features over time. So this is primarily where we're looking at. So we're willing to look in a broad sense at the range of effects and solutions that are available to us. Next slide, please. One of our basic standings is to kind of put this in the context of our long-term perspectives. Many of the other presenters have commented that seepage barriers have been considered as part of the long-term solution for it. And in fact, a dynamic seepage barrier in terms of the pumping that we do along the boundary of the park now is in place today. So we recognize this issue. We also recognize that we're going to be having higher stages coming to Everglades National Park. We're going to see changes in the water levels at L29 and in Northeast Shark Slough. And so the challenges that are with us now are changing over time. We we have an overall perspective that we would like to improve flow to Biscayne National Park. And I will specifically say that we're looking at dry season flows to the central and southern portions of the bay where they're most limited. We consider this seepage barrier as part of an overall management. It's not necessarily to be looked at as a fixed impermeable complete barrier to flow. It's part of an overall seepage strategy. The semi-penetrating walls that Walter brought up in his conversation have certain benefits, and we're thinking in those general terms. We think that when you add a seepage barrier to this, we want to see that the project considers how does this give us more flexible operations rather than less. We want to be sure that we're looking at that as part of an overall strategy. And we want to be very careful to have this in the context of climate change. So there's been a standing question from Craig Grossenbacher on the list about whether we're looking at protecting against sea level rise and saltwater intrusion in the aquifer in particular, based on the current conditions. And we would say, no, not just the current conditions, that's part of it, but certainly looking at the projections should be part of this. So we would be glad to let the science lead us on the overall outcome of this. So next slide, please. So I'm going to quickly go through 3 slides. Overview, just reminding us what we're doing. We're looking to increase stages on this slide. Continue next slide. And one more slide, so that we get to the point where we're going from increasing stages in the park and increasing, let's call it dry season flows to the bay while maintaining flood protection. And this is really, if you just look at this, this is the overall challenge that we're dealing with. I could have drawn 2 more circles on this slide to say that we're trying to manage increasing flow coming down from the northwest through the conservation areas. And we're trying to manage yet another a really good coastal project that we want to be involved with, this BBC project, where we're connecting the needs of these 2 parks and across the model land region. So we're thinking in a more regional sense down here on the southern end. So we're starting to move towards that. Next slide, please. The hydraulic ridge and the curtain wall, in our mind, they work together. We're not in this project talking about removing the hydraulic ridge features that are available to us, but I would expect that we'd have some changes in operations along the way. Next slide. So while we're increasing stages in the park, the challenge is going to grow. It's going to have a larger head gradient, pushing more water across. The flow under the barrier is reduced, but not eliminated. The total amount of groundwater that moves with that will change. We'll need to think about the operations of the existing hydraulic ridge. We'll have to think about what we've just started to put in place through COP and other changes we've done over time. With this new feature available to us as part of the overall management structure, I think that's a really critical piece that needs to be considered. And at this stage in the process, I just want to make sure that we're staying as broad as possible to consider those options. Next slide. And the previous strategy, this is one of the slides that was in a previous presentation some time ago and showed up again in the presentations today, just to give us an overview on these different sections of curtain wall that we've been looking at already. Needs to be looked at again, and it needs to be looked at with the flow to Biscayne as one of our primary concerns. We want to make sure that we're maintaining or coming up with operational ways to maintain and compensate for changes in that flow to Biscayne. We want to make sure that we're optimizing conveyance into what I'm calling the southeastern natural areas, which are really the areas defined by the BBC, the C-111 West, and the BBCW projects. I've had a discussion, and I'm glad to see that some of our Natural Academies people are with us today. I've had discussions where I've pointed out that we have a much broader, deeper data set available to us now than we did 20 years ago, as many of our CERT projects were being first envisioned and first getting their initial design and ideas on the page. We should be leveraging that data set to a greater extent. And in the current study earlier today, you heard that there would be this additional geophysical work done. That's really critical to understanding and getting our modeling right in the region, making sure that we incorporate that into models, that we verify that we're using that data in the models, that we reach over to our partners in the region, in the built region, and make sure that we're using the available groundwater data as part of both understanding that we're setting our models up right and making sure that we're validating that the outcome of the models is giving us something reasonable against the current system, our baseline testing, so we understand that we're getting this right. There's a lot of data. We need to make sure we're working with that data. And we're going to look at other opportunities as they arise. I'll go into that a little bit. Next slide. So we have a number of regional projects that are part of the current operations, part of SEP, part of just these long-term plans that have been in place. One of them that comes to mind here is in the center of this is Bird Drive Basin. And this is one of many features that we'll need to consider how that fits in our overall strategy. Does it give us some ability to store and transfer? It's not known for strong storage. Is it more of a flow equalization case? Maybe that's the case. Is it got some other use that we haven't thought about that will impact water quality in the region, or in some other way buffer and provide flexibility in operations that we had yet to consider? So I want to make sure that we're looking across these features and we're thinking of them without having the blinders of our initial ideas of what those projects were, but being open to what the projects can be based on the current system, the built system with the seepage barrier, and the idea of what we've been able to do in the hydraulic ridge and the pumping systems we have available to us now. So there's a lot of possibility. And that final point there is really important, that we need to really consider the current objectives we're trying to meet, as well as the original intent that we have for those various features that are in and around the seepage barrier zone. They will have a big influence on the ability of this project to be successful. Next step. We ourselves bring modeling expertise to this. We have the M3EMP, and in this particular area, it's got certain strengths in groundwater flow, being able to do work in those areas and do that well. We've also got ability to incorporate groundwater in the modeling into a canal flow, like 11 portion. So this project, this model will give us one of, let's call it a unique and separate tool from those that are already being used at the district, to look at this system from another modeling perspective and make sure that we have more certainty and more comfort in the results we're getting. And that's really what I want to think about managing uncertainty. The second part of managing uncertainty is that doing extensive modeling in terms of the standard modeling approaches, which include sensitivity testing and range testing, adjusting various features against the baseline, and then playing through some longer term extreme scenarios, because we need to be careful with what will happen with changing climate. Then all of those pieces are available to us and can be looked at through modeling. And it's going to be not about eliminating any risk, but about managing that risk, managing the uncertainty in the model, managing the overall project in a very careful and consistent way. And next slide. To that respect, we, the NPS, brings some staff that we're willing to look at it from the modeling and operations point of view. We bring the modeling itself that we're able to do. We can also weigh in on the modeling that's being done at the district and give independent set of eyes to take a look and make sure that we're on the right page and we're working together. We can also give technical analysis on the current conditions, evaluation of alternatives. We can even get into specific studies such as that geotechnical or LiDAR work and take a closer look at what's being done there and make sure that it's being properly incorporated into the overall seepage barrier considerations and development of the project. And then the last thing is we're here for our community. So there's a number of you on the phone that reach out to us on a regular basis. Feel free to keep doing that. I'd like to hear your voices, like to know your concerns, and you're helping us find the right way through these projects so that we're working to the greater benefit overall for the project and for the environment. And with that, I say thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. And the last of the invited talks is from Jason Engel, Chief of Water Resources Engineering Branch at Jacksonville District, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Jason, when you're ready, take it away.
Thank you, Akeem. Good morning, everyone. Having the benefit of going after the other speakers, I will say that they have stolen part of my message, but in a good way. I think that there's alignment among what everyone has presented up till now. And so I'm going to provide a relatively brief perspective from the Corps. Next slide, please. And so the first thing that I'd like to do is say up front that Jacksonville District Army Corps of Engineers, we're supportive of this effort. We're supportive of the timing of this effort. And it's been brought up that, and I'll discuss a little bit about the Biscayne Bay and Southeastern Everglades study. And so we are supportive of this effort overall. I'm going to discuss a few projects that are in the immediate vicinity of the curtain wall study, and update everyone on their progress. Next slide, please. So the first project, and Brenda covered this earlier, is the C-111 South Dade project, which is complete. And as those who have been involved in this program know, this was a long road. And we're operating this system, and it's making a real difference. Right now, we're conducting what's called a post-authorization change report to address temporary pump station 332 pump stations in the southern part of this project. And public review of that is underway. We completed the report in May, and we expect it to be considered in WRDA 2020. The next project is the modified water deliveries to Everglades National Park. Again, most will be familiar with this project. This was a long time in planning, and it is also complete. We are wrapping up the combined operational plan, which is the operational plan for the system. We're going to be completing that in August. There's an EIS in the Federal Register that was published in January. We have a final EIS scheduled for June. And the progress and completion required to support SEP implementation. Next slide. And so to talk about SEP, we have this update. We are working with the district to implement SEP quickly. There has been considerable funding the last several years to implement this project. We're in design on many aspects of the SEP, and actually going to move to construction and award a construction contract this year. And as most know, the district, Water Management District, is also in design and going to move toward construction of elements of the SEP. Yeah, and then finally, yeah, you can go to the next slide. And finally, I would say that, well, actually go back one slide, I'm sorry. What I would like to note about the SEP, and one thing that's important, is you'll notice in the figure where you see S334, and just south of that, there is a dark red or brown. That represents a curtain wall that's an authorized project feature in SEP. And so I think it's notable that this SERP project authorized that feature. Now that is essentially coincident location with the rock miners wall. And so this SEP component has essentially already been constructed, but it's notable that that this concept is certainly, as outlined today, is not new and has actually been implemented as part of a federal plan, though it's been constructed by the rock miners as a mitigation effort. Next slide. Finally, I would like to say a few words about the Biscayne Bay and Southeastern Everglades Ecosystem Restoration Project. This is something that people will probably be much less familiar with. It's a study that we're working on the PMP right now, the Project Management Plan. The study will kick off this summer, and it's to address flow of water to Biscayne Bay National Park and the areas to the south. And it's important, and it was mentioned both in the comments and by some of the speakers, that we need to evaluate this entire system together. And that includes the groundwater and surface water flows to Biscayne Bay and Card Sound. And so as we work with the Water Management District and all of the other agencies who are going to be involved in this effort that we're talking about today, we will be also scoping this study, this next SERP study. And so it's important that the schedule that's been outlined has the planning effort wrapping up in early 2021, because we need to understand the performance of any proposed wall as we consider the BBCR project. and it has to do with the surface water and groundwater budget. And so the timing is good for this, because if we were to plan the BBC project and we did not have an evaluation of the wall yet, it might be more difficult to implement the wall later. It might require reevaluation of this project. And so I think we're doing things in the right order. Finally, last slide. I would just summarize by saying that we support the study. It's not currently part of a federally authorized project. As I said, the CEP authorized a curtain wall that's essentially already been constructed. There's potential that it could be brought in under what's the post-authorization change report, perhaps to a SERP project. It could be a new federal feasibility study with the Water Management District as a partner. Or as in the third bullet, it could be a non-federal action, and then the Army Corps of Engineers, we would evaluate it as a Section 408 review to the Central and Southern Florida project. We think that the objectives of the curtain wall study are in alignment with the federal interest in the combined operating plan and the SERP projects. And that is to provide restoration, water for restoration, and increase the flows south while maintaining the project purposes of the CNSF system. And that is water supply and flood risk management principally, among other things. And so when I talk about water supply, I want to make a distinction that that is not limited to just agricultural, municipal, and industrial, but also for the environment. Obviously, it's been mentioned by the other speakers that it's important to make sure that the South Dade curtain wall considers maintaining the benefits in COP, in the Modified Water Deliveries Project, and doing no harm or providing benefits to Biscayne Bay in the southeastern Everglades. I would expand that to say to do no harm, period. And so I think the other speakers have said those are clear goals. The Water Management District acknowledges that. And so the Corps of Engineers, we're committing a team of people to work with and work with the Water Management District on this study. Although it's not a federal study, we will be engaged all along. And they, of course, are engaged with us, with all other agencies on the BBCR. And so we'll be talking about BBCR and making sure that there's full coordination between that new SERP study and this effort by the Water Management District. That concludes my my statements for today. And I would be willing to take question and answer as with everyone else on the panel.
Thank you very much, Jason. So at this time, I'm doing a time check. We're at about noon, just a little bit past noon. And I think we made a little bit of time. So I'd like to use the opportunity to allow people who are interested to raise their hands, be called on, and make a statement or share comments. And if there are any follow-ups to questions that were asked that hadn't been fully answered, to maybe ask those questions. For the questions still, though, I would like the answers to be typed. But certainly, if you want to make any comment or share an opinion, I would like to invite interested members attending to raise their hands so that they can be called upon to make a statement. And to raise your hands if you're on the phone, I believe it's *9. And then if you are called upon to unmute yourself, would be *6. If you are using the web feature, on mine, the raise your hand button is right under the participants tab, and you can mute and unmute yourself from there or from the bottom of your screen. So if there's anybody who wishes to make a statement, kindly raise your hand and will be called upon. I see a hand raised. Mr. Van Lent, or Dr. Van Lent, could somebody please
Yes, this is Tom Van Lent from the Everglades Foundation. Yeah, thank you very much for holding this. I think it's been in the works for a long time, so it's good to see it launched. I do have a couple of comments and concerns. I was a little bit more than a little concerned about the way the objectives are stated, that this is just a balance between flood control and water supply. And I heard the comments from Jennifer Reynolds that says, no, we're trying to at least have maintain the benefits from the restoration projects and if possible, optimize them. But I did not see that in slide 19, for example, or the way the project is formulated. And that's of concern to me because project outcomes are determined by how you formulate the project. And if it's just going to balance flood control and water supply, then that's all you'll do, I think. And the next comment I would say is that the scope, if it's just limited to a curtain wall, may be too narrow. I think you heard comments that it has to work with other parts. There may have to be operational changes, and there may also have to be other project elements. For example, curtain walls are very good probably at flood control, but that simply changing the curtain wall configuration may not be the best way to address the water supply. No one wants to see a reduction in water supply. So, but a one tool is probably not always. You may have to look at how other components fit in or some other solutions to deal with mitigating some of the effects. I would like to just reiterate my concern about making sure you've identified what the expectations are for the natural system. What I heard was basically we're going to make it put in a curtain wall to improve flood protection, making water levels higher in wet periods and wet seasons, but not have an effect or minimal effect in the dry periods or droughts. So all I'm going to do then is amplify fluctuations in the marsh, making Everglades National Park act like a reservoir. That's not compatible with restoration. That is the opposite of restoration. So how you define those objectives is going to be really critical, and then how you evaluate the outcome is also going to be very important. I do think there's a lot of opportunities with a potential curtain wall. I mean, I think that's clear. I am concerned that it does look like you've already decided on what depth to put things at, what the optimal trade-off is between flood control and water supply, and then look at the consequences in the marsh. But I don't know if that's, I mean, if you've already got all this decided, then please make it sure that we understand what the objectives are and what your constraints are so that we can comment directly. We stand ready to offer our technical capacity and modeling efforts and give constructive comments, but I do think the project has to be framed correctly. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. The next hand up, and Tom, I'd like us to kind of engage on that a little, but I'd like to give other people an opportunity to raise their hands and comment. The next hands I see up looks like I see Tom again. Am I looking at this right, Devon?
Yeah, it seems like somebody used the same link.
Oh, no, that was me. I was trying to lower my hand and I hit raise my hand. So that was my fault. Technical glitch. Apologize.
I thought you raised two hands because you really, really wanted to speak, Tom. So it looks like there aren't any other comments. Is there anybody else who wants to make a comment? Let's see. Yes, there's Bob Johnson. Please, could you unmute him?
Okay, can you hear me all right now?
Yeah.
So my question is following up on the discussion that Walter had on the Central Everglades project. So we have in place a seepage barrier that I would say meets the expectations of what would have been included in the Central Everglades project. So I'm trying to figure out, what does that mean? Does it give us the opportunity to use the authority for a seepage barrier and SEP to potentially expand what's in place now? I'll use the example of federal funding. So could federal funding be applied toward this type of a project, since SEP included a seepage barrier? Can SEP expand on what's already there now, or to just kind of check the box and say, well, that's done? And I know that's more a question to the Corps, but I'm sure the district and the Corps have been talking about this in particular.
That's a good question. So what I'll do is I'm kind of noting this, and I'm floating questions to the panelists on the background to see if anybody wants to take those. Are there any other hands up before we start engaging with some of those earlier questions? Okay, I do not see any other hands up. And so to the last question you asked, Jason, would you be able to speak to that a little bit? Or is that something that's a little bit early to talk about?
Sorry, I'm trying to get myself off of mute. Which question?
Bob Johnson, do you want to repeat your question, or should I try to paraphrase for you? Let me paraphrase it. So Bob Johnson asked if having the rock miners wall in an area that's coincident with where SEP recommended a project, does that create an opportunity for federal participation, or could we expand the wall in SEP? I hope I captured that question correctly, but essentially it's along those lines.
Right, I know. It does present an opportunity. We would have to go back and evaluate. We have to take a look at the project purpose for that wall, for that feature in SEP. And then it has to be decided whether a wall located perhaps south of that one would still achieve the same objectives that were intended for the original portion of the wall, the one that's already been constructed. And so if those matched up, there may be an opportunity to do a post-authorization change report. If they don't match up well enough, then it may be more difficult to alter our authorization to bring in a segment of wall. But the door is not closed on that as an option. I think that's something that we have to actively consider.
Thanks, Jason. And if there's a need for a follow-up, please do the same thing, raise your hand. And Tom, you just thought I'd add a few things. Hopefully, at least I'm hopeful that with this process, that we'll have the opportunity to do a full analysis. I think what we were sharing today was work that we had done in the past. I think as in response to some of the written questions, Walter explained that at the time, which was before COP, we used different type of operations. My expectation is that for this project, we would redo the analysis necessary to support the wall or the solution that evolved as part of this initiative, as part of this tasking that we have. What we've tried to do is to gather information so that we can remove some of the uncertainty we had the last go around. And we fully expect that as things evolve, it may become necessary to address, I expect it will be necessary to address not only adding the wall, but also what changes to operation would take advantage of having the wall and its performance, both in shoring up and getting benefits to restoration, and also in addressing the flood control, water supply, flows to Biscayne Bay, saltwater intrusion, and similar issues that are being raised by stakeholders as we engage. So I think we haven't, no decisions have been made. We have done some exploration and we have shared. We're hoping that through this process, either that work we've done previously will be validated and reinforced or modified or refined, but whatever we need to do in a transparent and public process will end up with a project that has broad support and addresses the issues that are being raised. Does anybody else on the panel want to add anything more? And are there any additional questions that any of the attendees have? Okay, we're at 12:18. The agenda says that 12:20 we'll start wrapping up. So maybe you'll find 2 minutes that I'll give you all. I want to thank everybody for attending this workshop. Oh, I see there's one last comment. Okay. There was an additional comment requesting that we expand the data collection. I'll pass this on to the project manager who's in charge of that project, and we'll look at the opportunity to maybe do more in data collection. I'll respond also to this in writing. So I want to thank everybody who's attended this. These virtual workshops are challenging, but they offer an opportunity to continue to work with the pandemic in place. We appreciate the attendance we have. We have several people who've attended, and we had good comments and engagement from folks. We look forward to continuing to engage with you as this project goes on. So where do we go from here? There will be a series of meetings that we'll be setting up with many stakeholders to have smaller group discussions, more extensive discussions where we can talk through multiple things. As I mentioned in trying to respond to Dr. Van Lent's comment, our process is open, and the project we ultimately will recommend is being formulated at this time. And as we continue through this over the next few months, what we come up with will be, again, shared in public processes with you all. The results of updated modeling will be shared, and our goal is that we will arrive at an eventual configuration with the appropriate features, gaps if necessary, or whatever needs to do, the correct depth to give us not only flood control benefits, which we certainly want to get, but also environmental improvements and enhancements, and it will address all of those key concerns that have been raised. I'm optimistic that we can successfully land this. I think the interest and the engagement is great, and I think if we all work hard towards this, we can get to a successful project that can move forward. We have heard, and we will continue to coordinate with the Corps and other partners on simultaneous efforts that are going on, including PBCA and other projects within the region. And we expect that we'll be reaching out to many of you again for a follow-on workshop later on in the process. The products, the slides that you saw will be made available. There's a district website that has been created. Is a subset of the South Dade website. I'll be able to share a link by email to people who are interested. If you are interested in getting some of the information that we've shared or additional information, please reach out to Brenda Mills, who is our project manager for this effort, and to Walter Wilcox, who is Chief of Modeling and the lead for the assessment part of this initiative. You could also reach out to me if you have my email. It's not on this slide, but Brenda and Walter will do an excellent job of getting your questions or your follow-up information to whomever needs to address them. I see that the link to the South Dade project has been provided on this slide. Please go there. You'll see all presentations we have made. It will provide a little bit more on the history and context of how we got to where we are, but it will also be where we will be sharing the information generated from these public workshops and additional pieces of information we wish to share with all of you as we formulate this project that has been identified as something that's highly beneficial within this region. So that's what I have for today. I'll kind of open the floor to Jennifer Reynolds if you want to add anything in closing, or Walter or Brenda Mills.
Thanks, Akin. I'd just like to thank everyone for their participation. There were some really great comments and questions. And this is why we do these types of workshops, is to make sure that we have an opportunity to include your comments and questions and concerns as we move forward into a planning arena for this project. And so I just really want to thank everyone for participating. I know it's difficult to do it in this format. And so thanks for all of your patience and perseverance as we move through this. And we look forward to meeting with you individually and as a group in the future as we move forward with this and other efforts.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And with that, I guess our workshop is closing. I will thank everybody, and please continue to track the progress of this project through the South Dade Projects website. Thank you very much.